What if everything you touched was taxed? Your glass, your paint, your paper, your tea, without your say, not once, but again and again, no vote, no voice, just orders from a parliament across an ocean. That wasn't just frustrating. In 1767, it was fuel, fuel for resistance, fuel for revolution, and it all started with something called the Townshend Acts. By the time the Townshend Acts hit the colonies in 1767, people were already on edge. Just a year before, Britain had repealed the hated Stamp Act after massive protests. It looked like things might calm down, but then, boom, a new round of taxes came in, this time sneaking into daily life. These weren't taxes on land or income. These were on the basics: windows, books, tea, even the paper you used to write a letter. And the worst part, the colonists had no say in any of it. In this video, we're going to break down why the Townshend Acts weren't just about money. They were about power, who had it, who didn't, and how ordinary people in Boston, New York, and beyond decided enough was enough. Because the story of liberty doesn't begin with battles, it begins with frustration. And the Townshend Acts made sure there was plenty of that. Imagine standing at your small shop counter in 1767. You've just unpacked a shipment, glass bottles for storing preserves, rolls of wallpaper, and a tin of paint for your customers down the street. It's not much, but it's honest work. Then a neighbor rushes in, pale and out of breath. He whispers what you hoped you wouldn't hear again. They've passed another tax. This time, it's on everything. This is what the Townshend Acts felt like to the average colonist. Not just laws passed by distant politicians, but sudden, creeping weight on daily life. After the uproar of the Stamp Act had finally cooled, many colonists thought maybe, just maybe, Parliament had learned its lesson. But then Charles Townshend, Chancellor of the Exchequer, stepped forward with a plan that quietly pulled the rug out from under them all. These new taxes weren't on luxury items or imports you could live without. They targeted necessities: glass, lead, paint, paper, and yes, even tea, everyday items, things used in households and workshops from Boston to Charleston. The British government justified it as a way to raise money to pay colonial governors and soldiers. But to colonists it looked like a trick, another tax without consent, another attempt to remind them who was really in charge. For someone like Reuben, a house painter in New York, the impact was immediate. His income came from mixing paints for wealthy merchants and middle-class shopkeepers trying to brighten up their homes or storefronts. Now, with every can he opened, he felt the sting of London's reach. His customers started putting off jobs, prices rose, profits fell. Reuben didn't speak in lofty words about liberty or natural rights. He just knew that he was being squeezed, and he had no say in it. It wasn't just economic pain, it was emotional. The laws also included something else that stung deeply: the right for customs officers to use writs of assistance. That meant British agents could search your home or business without warning, looking for smuggled goods. For colonists who had grown up believing in privacy, in fairness, this was more than an insult. It felt like a violation. You were guilty before you were proven innocent. And yet, even through this pressure, people began to push back. Not with muskets, not yet, but with words and with organization. Newspapers like the Boston Gazette filled their columns with angry letters. Pamphlets circulated with plain language arguments. Why are we taxed without a vote? Why is our property no longer our own? Leaders like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson began writing and speaking out. But the frustration started much lower, at kitchen tables, in taverns, and among artisans and farmers who were just trying to survive. Dickinson's letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania didn't stir people because he sounded like a scholar. They stirred people because he sounded like them, honest, hurting, and tired of being ignored. And as for Charles Townshend himself, He didn't live to see the fallout of his policies. He died suddenly just months after the acts were passed, but the damage had already been done. His plan to tax the colonies quietly had lit another spark, one that would grow louder, hotter, and far more dangerous in the years to come. So the next time we think about the American Revolution, it's worth remembering that it wasn't just about big speeches or battlefield glory. Sometimes it started with a brushstroke of taxed paint, a letter to a newspaper, or a cup of tea poured with quiet anger. Because when governments forget to listen, people don't always shout at first. Sometimes they whisper, but those whispers, if ignored long enough, turn into something much harder to ignore. That's what made the Townshend Acts different. They weren't a single, sweeping tax like the Stamp Act. They were a series of small duties, taxes tucked into daily life, placed on goods the colonies needed but couldn't easily make themselves. Things like glass, lead, paint, paper, and of course, tea. Let's break that down. Glass was taxed at 3 pence per pound. That might not sound like much, but consider this. Windows were expensive. Most colonists didn't have big glass panes like we do today. They used small ones often imported from Britain. If you were a builder or a shop owner repairing storm damage, that 3 pence added up fast. Tea, also taxed at 3 pence per pound, hit even harder, not because of the amount, but because of what tea meant. It wasn't just a drink. It was part of the rhythm of daily life, especially in urban centers like Boston, New York, and Charleston. Even modest households had their tea rituals. Taxing it wasn't just an economic move. It was personal. It slipped into the most social, most domestic parts of colonial culture. Paint had its own duty, so did lead, mostly used for things like pipes and bullets. Paper, already a precious commodity, became a symbol of the tax overreach after all. It was paper that carried the words of protest, the notices of meetings, the very pamphlets criticizing Parliament. On paper, British paper, the plan looked solid. Charles Townshend predicted that these taxes would raise 40,000 a year, a tidy sum. That money, he said, would be used to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges in the colonies. No more relying on local assemblies for their paychecks. The Crown would fund them directly, and that right there was the real issue, because money in the end is power. If Parliament controlled the purse and the governors were paid by Parliament, then what happened to local control? What happened to the assemblies that colonists had fought for and believed in? It wasn't just about the taxes themselves. It was about who held the strings, and here's the twist. The revenue didn't even live up to the hype. In reality, these taxes brought in far less than expected. The system was riddled with inefficiency, smuggling grew more sophisticated, and colonial resistance turned consumers toward local alternatives, even if they weren't always better. Cloth homespun on spinning wheels replaced British fabric. Local newspapers doubled down on encouraging boycotts, and merchants who once traded proudly under British flags now did so with a cautious eye on public anger. Take someone like Martha, a merchant's wife in Boston. She managed the shop books while her husband was away on business. She saw first, and how every new shipment from London stirred debate. Should they sell taxed goods or join the growing boycott? Her regulars asked questions now. They were thinking twice, and her ledgers showed the cost, not just in coins, but in trust. Even customs agents sent to enforce the taxes became lightning rods for anger. Some were tarred and feathered, others saw their homes ransacked. The revenue men weren't just enforcing taxes, they were enforcing Parliament's growing shadow over the colonies, and all for what? A few £1,000s. It wasn't just poor planning, it was a failure to understand what these taxes truly meant to people already stretched thin. They weren't numbers, they were symbols of distance, of powerlessness, of being told what to do again. So yes, the Townshend Acts were about money, but the real cost wasn't in pounds sterling. It was in trust, in unity, and in the growing feeling from Charleston to Portsmouth that the only way to keep control of their lives was to take it back. When Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, they thought the colonies would grumble and move on. What they didn't expect was how fast and how fiercely ordinary people would organize against it. And it wasn't just speeches or editorials, it was economic warfare fought with boycotts, homemade goods, and backdoor trade. From town to town, committees were formed to keep track of who was following the non-importation agreements. Merchants who continued to bring in taxed goods from Britain were named in newspapers, sometimes publicly shamed, and often pressured into falling in line. Stores that complied displayed signs in their windows, "No British goods sold here." Those that didn't, they were empty more often than not. But this movement didn't rest on politicians or town leaders. It lived in the kitchens and workshops of women like Hannah, a widow in Connecticut raising 3 children on her own. She stopped buying imported fabric and instead taught herself to spin wool from local farms. Her hands ached at night, and the cloth wasn't always pretty, but it was hers. She made dresses for her daughters, wrapped them in resistance, and passed along a message. We can live without what they are selling. And while some colonists proudly embraced the boycott, others turned to a different method: smuggling. British tariffs created a booming underground market. Ships from the Dutch Republic, the West Indies, and even France started showing up more frequently along the coast, often under cover of darkness. Barrels of molasses, crates of glass, bundles of textiles, all slipped ashore without a single tax collected. Smugglers became local heroes, not criminals, but providers. Men like Caleb, a sailor in Rhode Island, saw smuggling not as theft, but as a duty. He risked jail every time he docked his schooner full of untaxed goods, but when he walked through town, people nodded with quiet respect. He wasn't just feeding his family, he was feeding a movement. And the impact didn't stay on this side of the ocean. Back in Britain, merchants started to notice the silence. Orders from the colonies slowed. Warehouses filled with unsold inventory. British textile workers were laid off. Ironmongers in Sheffield had fewer buyers. Shopkeepers in London wrote desperate letters to Parliament asking, what happened to the colonies? They knew exactly what happened. The American colonists weren't fighting with guns yet. But they were hitting Britain where it hurt, its wallet, and perhaps most impressive was how many ordinary people bought in. This wasn't top down, it was from the ground up. People who had no right to vote, no seat in Parliament, and no political clout found a different kind of power in what they chose to buy or not buy. The boycotts weren't perfect. Some people broke them. Some merchants gave in, but the broader effect was undeniable. Britain passed taxes expecting quiet obedience. What it got was grassroots rebellion, built on tea leaves, homespun thread, and midnight shipments under the moon. And that's the quiet genius of it. When people say the American Revolution began with shots fired at Lexington, they're only partly right. Before the muskets, there were meetings, there were women with spinning wheels. There were smugglers with fast boats, there were shopkeepers who said no more. Revolutions don't just begin with noise. Sometimes they start with a whisper and a refusal to pay to Parliament. Sending troops seemed like the logical next step. To colonists, it was something else entirely, a clear sign that force was replacing dialogue. The arrival of British troops wasn't just a matter of law enforcement. It was a political message delivered at the barrel of a gun. And it changed everything. The tension that followed wasn't explosive at first. It was slow, constant, and heavy. You could feel it in every awkward glance, every footstep that echoed down cobblestone alleys. For someone like Eliza, a merchant's daughter in Boston, the soldiers outside her family's shop weren't protecting anything. They were bad for business. Customers didn't want to walk past rows of uniformed men to buy ink or sugar. And her mother never felt safe alone at the counter. The soldiers weren't always violent, but their presence was a threat in itself. Then there were the customs officials, those men charged with enforcing the taxes. They had legal permission to search homes and warehouses using documents called writs of assistance, broad search warrants that didn't require specific cause. That meant if you were suspected of smuggling, they didn't need hard evidence. They could walk into your house, rifle through your belongings, and leave you to clean up the mess. This struck a nerve, even among colonists who weren't political. The idea that the government could invade your home without warning felt like tyranny. Privacy, especially in one's own home, was sacred. That's where trust in the British system really began to collapse. Men like Richard, a silversmith in Boston, had never seen themselves as radicals. He believed in law, paid what he owed, and kept to himself. But after customs officers broke into his shop looking for smuggled tea, of which there was none, he started attending town meetings. He started listening when men like Samuel Adams spoke about liberty and rights. It only took one visit from the king's men to make him see that something was terribly wrong, and it wasn't just the searches. It was the escalation. By 1769, Boston looked and felt more like a city under occupation than a free town. Soldiers didn't answer to the locals. Their presence only grew. Arguments between civilians and troops became common. Fistfights, property damage, accusations hurled back and forth. No one trusted anyone. Then came the inevitable flashpoint. On a cold night in March 1770, after years of strain, things finally broke. A crowd of angry Bostonians confronted a British sentry. The soldiers called for backup. Snowballs turned into stones, words became shouts, and in the chaos shots were fired. 5 colonists were left dead. The British called it a tragic misunderstanding. The colonists called it murder, and the rest of the continent heard the news and took a step closer to revolution. That night would go down in history as the Boston Massacre, but in truth it had started long before the first shot. It began with taxes passed without consent. It grew with soldiers stationed on peaceful streets. It festered in midnight raids and daylight standoffs. This wasn't just tension. It was a deep wound, cut open by power and patched poorly with force. The British government believed they could hold the colonies together with soldiers and customs warrants. But every rifle on the street, every home searched without cause, only pushed the people further away. Because at the end of the day, when laws are enforced without justice, and when power answers protest with intimidation, something changes in the hearts of the people. They stop asking for change and start preparing to take it. By 1769, their resistance was working, but not in the way you might expect. It wasn't Parliament that blinked first, it was British merchants. Over in London, the numbers weren't lying. Orders from the colonies had plummeted. Warehouses sat full of unsold goods. Dockworkers and craftsmen, especially in port cities like Liverpool and Bristol, were losing jobs. Many had no idea what the Townshend Acts even were, but they were feeling the sting of them just the same, and they were angry. One cloth merchant named Edmund, who had been shipping dyed fabrics to Boston for over a decade, found himself writing letter after letter to Parliament. If the Americans will not buy, he warned, we shall not sell. He wasn't alone. Dozens of British merchants, investors, and tradesmen began lobbying Parliament, not out of sympathy for colonial rights, but out of fear for their livelihoods. Back in the colonies, the boycotts held strong. People like Deborah, a spinner in Virginia, kept their homes warm with determination. She and other women met weekly to spin homespun cloth, refusing British textiles no matter how fine or tempting they looked in the shop windows. Her husband, a tavern owner, served no imported tea. Their children wore rougher clothes, but they were proud, and so, under mounting pressure, economic, political, and social, Parliament began to bend. In March of 1770, just weeks after the Boston Massacre had shocked the colonies and raised tensions to a new level, Parliament made a quiet retreat. Most of the Townshend duties on glass, lead, paint, and paper were repealed. It wasn't a public apology, there was no grand gesture, but it was a sign that collective resistance had worked, except for one thing: tea. The British government decided to keep the tax on tea not for the revenue, which was minimal, but to make a point. Parliament wanted to remind the colonies who held the authority to tax. In their eyes, removing the tax entirely would look like surrender, so they left that one small duty in place, like a pin on a grenade. To Parliament, it was strategic. To the colonists, it was insulting, because by now, tea wasn't just a drink, it was a symbol. Every cup poured from a taxed shipment was a reminder that Parliament still didn't see them as equals. Every boil of water carried with it a choice: drink the tea and accept the terms, or push back harder. This tiny decision would have enormous consequences. A few years later, when Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, tensions that had simmered since the Townshend Acts came roaring back. Colonists saw the law as a trap, a way to sneak taxed tea back into their homes at a cheaper price, still without their consent. And when 3 ships carrying East India Company tea arrived in Boston, well, we know how that ended, but that night, the night patriots boarded those ships and dumped the tea into the harbor, didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of years of struggle, years of boycotts, years of economic resistance and political pushback, years of ordinary people choosing to say no, even when it cost them. The partial repeal of the Townshend Acts in 1770 wasn't a total win, but it was proof that persistence mattered, that when people stood together, tailors, farmers, shopkeepers, women at spinning wheels and men at shipping docks, they could bend the might of an empire. But that last tax on tea, that was the fatal mistake, because it showed that Parliament hadn't learned the right lesson. They backed down on paper, but not in principle, and the people saw it. Sometimes revolutions don't begin with a single spark. Sometimes they begin with a long, slow burn. The Townshend Acts were part of that burn, a fuse that, once lit, would not be easily put out. So what did the Townshend Acts really do? They didn't just raise prices. They raised awareness. They revealed a government more interested in control than consent, and they awakened a people who had once seen themselves as loyal subjects, but now began to see themselves as something else entirely. The British thought they could tax quietly, that they could enforce loyalty with customs agents and redcoats, but instead they taught the colonists a powerful lesson. Resistance doesn't always begin with bullets. Sometimes it begins with saying no. No to buying imported cloth. No to sipping taxed tea. No to being ruled without a voice. And what made this movement powerful wasn't just the speeches in taverns or the names in newspapers. It was the persistence of ordinary people. Merchants who closed their shops. Women who spun homespun thread by candlelight. Sailors who smuggled goods through cold coastal nights, and neighbors who stood shoulder to protect one another from search and seizure. They didn't always know what independence would look like, but they knew what injustice felt like. The repeal in 1770 may have seemed like a victory, and in many ways it was, but leaving the tea tax in place. That one decision showed the colonies that Parliament still hadn't listened. That even after all the protest, all the boycotts, all the tension, they still believed power didn't need permission. And that's what made what came next inevitable. So when we think about the American Revolution, don't just picture the battles. Picture the shopkeeper who locked his doors, the widow who refused imported tea, the committee that documented who sold British goods, and who didn't. This was a revolution born not only on fields, but in markets and kitchens and wharves, and maybe that's the real legacy of the Townshend Acts. They proved that people don't just rise up when they're crushed. They rise when they're ignored, because in the end, the desire for liberty doesn't vanish under pressure. It sharpens. Like this video if you believe small acts can lead to big change. Subscribe to Liberty Unfolded for more stories where freedom begins long before the battlefield.